Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from Derbyshire, UK, Mr. Richard Gerver. Is it Gerver or Gerver?
It's Gerver. Yeah, you got it right. Absolutely. Thank
you.
Sorry,
I should have checked with you.
Don't worry.
Richard is a world-renowned speaker and author, and he's also a LinkedIn learning instructor. So, Richard, before we speak about your role and as a speaker, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
Wow. My journey has been a series of unplanned, happy accidents. I think governed by two things, passion and instinct. So I started out life when I first left school, much to my mother's chagrin, not wanting to go to university, but wanting to be an actor. You can imagine what that does to your parents, right? And the worst thing that could have happened to me happened at 17. I got into repertory theatre in London, and I thought I was going to be the next Laurence Olivier. One essential flaw to my plan was essentially I was rubbish. Anyway, I kept trying and pursuing that for a couple of years until I finally got the message. During that time, in order to earn some money, I worked in below the line advertising. I worked in a state agency. I did a whole range of things. Anyway, I eventually, I think much to my parents' relief, did go to university. And in my first year, met a young woman who was training to be a teacher. And in order to get a date with this wonderful young woman, I told her that teaching was the most wonderful thing on earth. Anyway, the date seemed to go okay. And just so that everybody watching or listening knows, we're about to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary. So I think it went okay. But anyway, as a result, I started, as our relationship developed, she used to ask me to go and do some work in her school with her children, and I fell in love. So I became a teacher eventually, had a wonderful career as a teacher and a school principal for nearly 20 years, the pinnacle of which we may talk about later. But I had some success as a school principal, which began really the change in my life. Again, there was no plan. I never wanted to leave education. But, you know, new doors opened, and particularly people wanted to understand how, when I'd become a school principal, to a very short story, we'd taken a state school the United Kingdom government felt was so bad they were going to close it down. I got the job, and within 18 months the school had won the UNESCO World Education Award. So of course, all of a sudden everybody wants to know your secret, and I didn't think we had a secret. I just think we'd done our job, right? But anyway, that meant that new doors opened for me, and people wanted to know about me, our story, my leadership methodology, and I had to kind of really reflect, and I just did what I believed was right. Anyway, that led me to my career now, which I've been doing for 16 years, which, as you said, is really working as a speaker and author, specializing in leadership, human potential. I'm passionate about human development and helping everybody I can to realize their full potential, but particularly through leadership. I suppose it's the educator in me. So I hope that kind of explains to everybody where I've been and where I am.
What an amazing journey. And let's now talk about you being a speaker. And when I was reading about you, you are the clearest and most passionate voice for radical change, both in education and business. Help me understand this particular phrase.
Well, I think for me, and it's interesting in a way, I'm not going to belittle the events of the last 3 years, but I think in a way, the last 3 years have kind of catalyzed and amplified what people like you and I and many of our listeners and viewers have known for a very long time. And that is that the world is turning faster and faster, more unpredictably. And that traditional model in both business and education of focusing on efficiency to maximize productivity is no longer the secret to longevity and success. But in so many elements of our education and business life, companies are still run and predicated on as long as we focus on efficiency and we maximize productivity, everything will be okay.
Correct.
And of course, what the events of the last 3 years have shown us in amplification is that simply is no longer the case. And so for me, my argument has always been that we've got to look beyond efficiency. We've got to stop the idea that all the new silver bullets, the new ideas, the new methodologies always seem to come back to how do we do what we've always done, but more effectively and more efficiently. And actually, we need to take a step back. And we need to realize we need different kind of people to lead different kind of organizations. And rather than largely being organizations that spend their energy and time being reactive and saying, okay, well, that event's happened, how do we respond to it? How do we create generations of people and organizations that are more front-footed? How do we get them to be more proactive? And I suppose for me, that's where so much of my study and my experience, I hope, comes to bear.
So, you did speak about the last 3 years. Can you, for my viewers and listeners, help me understand what are some of the challenges that you have been addressing?
Again, I think for me, so much of that is we felt on a human scale, on a global scale. And by the way, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I think this is the first global event where every human being on the planet has had to feel connected. In the past, we've always been able to look at different regions of the world and go, oh, that's awful, but it's there. Or it's awful, but it's not us, right? And actually, I think it's given us a real chance to reflect, to think about ourselves, our interrelationships, and to reflect deeply on our human behaviors and our responses. And I think more than anything, what the last 3 years has amplified for so many of us, no matter how badly we may have been impacted by the events of the pandemic, is that profound feeling of powerlessness, of the feeling that actually the levers we used to hold on to control our lives were wrenched from us. And those emotional reflexes and responses we felt, whether it's been kind of mental paralysis, trying really hard to understand, but the more we do, the more it bounces off. The denials, those moments where maybe it's not as bad or as serious, or it won't happen here. Those moments of anger, the short-fusedness, or just the despair, the lack of I think it's taught us how much just little moments of joy have punctuated our lives and driven us to overcome adversity, right? And I think when all of those things are removed from us, what that's done is taught us about the importance of curiosity, of being able to engage in questioning, even in those moments of despair, saying, okay, that's the reality, but where are the chinks of light? Where are the opportunities? How can I just find at least one lever to hold on to? And I suppose for me, what that comes down to, going all the way back full circle, I guess, to my first career, I've always been fascinated by the fact that I remember when I trained to be a teacher, a university lecturer once said to me, we learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lifetime before we're 5 years old. Now, I'm not talking about the knowledge that comes with experience, right? But most of us learn to walk, talk, understand vocal intonation, facial expression, but all those things happen before we're 5. And so what I think we need to take from the last 3 years is the power of curiosity, the art of asking questions, and realizing that those things aren't frivolous or naive, but actually they're ways to feel that we have control and vision for our own future and the future of our organizations moving forwards.
Fascinating. Thank you. What a great response. You also speak about the schools of tomorrow. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the schools of tomorrow.
Sure. Well, again, for me, so much of what we've done in education over the last 50 years is slip into the mistake of thinking, there have been loads of new progressions and technology, of course, being one of the greatest, right, innovations, the continued development of AI, of connectivity, of all of those things. But in education, all we ever do is go, okay, that's interesting, but how do we use that to do what we've already done? How do we do it to improve our exam results, right? Rather than taking a step back and saying, is that entire methodology actually best preparing our young people for the future? And as you yourself, a hugely successful leader in business and organizations, will know, the human characteristics and qualities we needed 50 years ago, which was centered around cognition and routine cognition, are no longer the vital assets of a future workforce. And so in a way, what we've got to do is create education systems not predicated on doing what we've always done more efficiently, but how do we create education systems that provide us with collaborators, with innovators, with problem solvers, you know, with people who really have those acute development of the soft human skills, which, you know, one of my sayings is, the soft skills are the hard currency of the future. And I think we need to build an education system that is predicated more around that vision.
And in this vision, do you see technology as a major game changer for educators and the kids in schools?
Absolutely. Right. I mean, two things. There's a caveat to that as well, Ash, which is, you know, I remember a few years ago, interviewing Eric Schmidt, the former executive chairman of Google. And I asked him the question, did he ever see a time where technology would replace the teacher? Because one of the greatest fears in education, and particularly from educators, is, will I be replaced by a machine? Right.
Yeah.
So I thought I'll ask him the question. His answer was immediate and unequivocal. He said, no, never. He said, technology is an incredible tool. It is a catalyst for change. It is a tool for empowerment, for the democratization of information. It will do many things we possibly can't even conceive. But education has always been and will always be at its heart about the development of human beings. And in order to develop human beings, you will always need high levels of human interaction. So I think if we look at technology not as a threat, but as an incredible catalyst, and I loved his phrase, by the way, you know, that it is a tool to democratize information. I think if we start to see technology in education around that idea, we can embrace it and use it fully, not to replace the education process, but to supplement it and amplify it.
Very interesting. The other question that I wanted to ask you was on culture. You know, the UK is a very, very multicultural country, and you would have seen that there are certain cultures, parents insist on education being, you know, you've got to be first in class, and country that I come from is particularly parents are very conscious about coming first in class and mathematics and economics and whatever else. My question is, how does culture impact education? How do you as an educator handle the differences in culture in your classes?
You know, I think that is one of the most pertinent, powerful questions around education and its future evolution. Partly, I mean, first of all, let me say that I don't blame any parent for caring passionately about their child and wanting the best for them. You know, to be honest, as a former teacher, I wish all my parents cared as passionately as some do in certain cultures, right? That's the first caveat. And so it's no wonder that what they want is the best of a replication of what they experienced or didn't have access to as children. So one of our great challenges is to take that desire and enthusiasm, but help inform parents about what the future model needs to look like in order to ensure the best chance of success for their child. So much of this is around communication and connectedness. You know, for so many years, education has always almost operated in a silo. You know, this is education, this is the workplace. And actually what I've tried to do through most of my career is create a bridge. We need a much stronger and tighter narrative between education and employability. And what that means is that we can help parents understand that transformation, that evolution, the new things to support and help and look for in the education system, but also as parents to support and develop. You know, we need to harness that passion of our parents, but help them vision the future differently from the past. You know, there is no doubt about it that for certain kids, and by the way, the one thing we know, right, is that data is the new oil. So kids who have mathematics slants, kids that understand data and number, for them that needs to be encouraged. But it shouldn't be for all children, and it isn't the only route. You know, entrepreneurship is going to be a massive part of the future. Cultural awareness, global understanding, the power to collaborate. And most importantly, I think it's important for parents to reflect on this, that a child's understanding of the things they can't do is not a weakness, it's a strength. And we need to help our parents and our children understand the three-dimensionality of what human success looks like now, and certainly moving forward into the future.
Well said. Thank you. You also talk about, Richard, the nature of our personal and professional responses to risk, change, creativity, and development. Help me understand this with an example.
Okay, so again, you know, this reflects quite a lot, I think, Ash, with what we've just talked about, right? And one of the things that I think is fascinating to me is, as I've gone through my own life and reflected personally and professionally, is the stakes we put on people being right, not making mistakes. Yet when I reflect on my professional life, what I realize is this: we learn nothing new by getting something right. We only ever learn something new from the point of a mistake or the realization that we don't know something or we can't do something. And actually, that's very acutely linked, not just to our ability to engage in learning and to engage in new and to embrace change. But, you know, the other thing about that is every time we overcome adversity, every time we make a mistake and learn from it, we're also putting resilience, more and more resilience into our locker. And of course, the one thing we know about life now, and as has been acutely underlined by the pandemic, is people moving into the next part of the 21st century and onward into the 22nd century, almost their greatest resource is their resilience and self-confidence. And that doesn't come from getting stuff right. It comes from overcoming adversity. And so for me, we need to recalibrate the way we see mistake-making, failure, or not knowing. And recalibrate it so everyone realizes that that is the moment at which they're going to progress personally and developmentally. And if we can recalibrate that, I think we're giving people of the future the greatest tool to succeed.
Very interesting. Richard, you're also an author, and all my viewers and listeners know I'm very partial to authors. Tell me about your books.
Wow. In a way, Ash, firstly, you know, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, I'm an accidental author, okay? I never believed that I was ever going to write a book. I don't know about you. You know, I used to look at authors in awe and books on shelves in bookshops like, but I suppose now the 4 books that have been published so far really reflect my professional journey. You know, the things I write about, I'm not an intellectual, I'm not an academic, I'm an observer. I'm an observer of life and behaviors. And when things interest me, that's when I feel inspired to write. You know, it's feeling there's so much in there, I've got to, you know, exercise it. So my 4 books really reflect that journey. So the first book, which was called Creating Tomorrow's Schools Today, was very much the story of my school as a school principal, that transformation, what we did, how we did it, why we did it. I was very lucky because that book was written, published at the right time, at the right place. It was translated across a number of languages and became a big seller, which meant publishers then started to come to me and say, what else have you got? And have you got anything that isn't education, but is about the same kind of themes? And so books 2 and 3 reflected that, really what I was seeing in the world, how I reflected and processed what I was doing and who I was working with. And so book 2 was called Change, Learn to Love It, Learn to Lead It, which changed my life perversely, because it became a #1 bestseller in the UK and the US. And of course, that changed everybody's perception of me. And it really was an exploration of why we find change hard and what we can do about that. And then book 3 stemmed from that. If you like, it was the bits I'd wished I'd written in the book around change. And that was called Simple Thinking. And really, it was an exploration of success. And is success really complicated, or does it come down to sort of more fundamental human instincts and behaviors? And again, that became a bestseller. And then the last book I've published to date was kind of a full circle thing. It was called Education, a Manifesto for Change. And really what that was as I reflected, I wrote that, but I started writing that book a decade after I left frontline education. And it was really based on all those moments and experiences I'd had in that decade where I'd learned things outside of education and thought, gosh, I wish I'd known that when I was an educator. So the final book really is an exploration of what needs to change in education and why, based on the lived experiences I've had from being an educator, working in some of the world's biggest organizations and corporations, and what I've learned back from that. And the next book, this is exclusive to, isn't actually going to be a non-fiction. I'm going to try for the first time to write a fictional book for young people about the themes of belonging and acceptance. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Amazing, amazing. Well, good luck with your 5th book. And
thank you.
I'm going to ask all my viewers and listeners to go and check out Richard Gerver on Amazon, and I'll go and check out his books as well. So, Richard, I've got time for 2 more questions. My next question is that you are a LinkedIn learning instructor. Tell me about what you do here.
Again, as is the recurring theme here, Ash.
You're very modest.
Accidental. So just before, about 9 months before the global pandemic really kicked off at the start of 2020, I was approached by LinkedIn, and LinkedIn had just bought the world's biggest learning portal, lynda.com, and integrated it into the LinkedIn kind of ecosphere, I suppose. And they'd been really interested in my work around change and simple thinking. And they said to me, look, could you do us a couple of courses, right? And I'd never really been involved or seen Lynda or LinkedIn Learning or any of those things. Anyway, they said, we'd love you to do something around those themes. What could we do? And we negotiated, we talked, and we looked up the analytics and what the world was wanting. Pardon me. And this is pre-pandemic. And we came up with 2 concepts. One was, how do you develop mental toughness in your team and people? And the other one, based on simple thinking, was how do you help people overcome complexity? And so I set to work writing and designing those courses. Eventually, the pandemic hit just at the time I should have been flying to California to film them. So it kind of put a hold for a while. Then it was like a James Bond movie, Ash, right? At my door one day, this huge, great trunk full of equipment arrived, right? And it said, do not open until you're instructed how to do it. It was like being in James Bond's office, right? Anyway, it was a studio in a box. I filmed the courses here, and they went live in November of 2021. And talk about zeitgeist, really. So the courses were prepared and written prior to COVID, but you can imagine on the themes of mental toughness and overcoming complexity, they were like right place, right time. And they're now viewed, 20, 30,000 times a month across the world by all of the subscribers of LinkedIn Learning. And in many ways, I'm beginning to explore whether that's a better vehicle than a written book for my future nonfiction work and thinking around leadership and development, because the reach is much bigger. It's much more interactive. And I think in many ways, particularly since the pandemic and the real advent of online work and learning, I think it's such a powerful medium. And so I've been very lucky to be involved in that. And again, we're working on a couple of new courses, which hopefully I'll be able to announce sometime in 2023.
Fascinating. And my last question to you, Richard, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. I'm going to ask you to wear your academician or your educator hat again. And based on your amazing journey and, everything you've so easily ascribed to just happened to you, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away?
I think the first I've already hinted at, and that is to remember that you learn nothing new by getting something right. So recalibrate that fear of failure and mistake making in your mind.
Yeah.
The second for me is something that a few years ago, I don't know if people can see over my shoulder here. There's a picture of me with President Obama, which I have to say was one of the proudest moments of my entire life. And something he said to me, which I think is the second mantra, he said, you know, when I look back on my 8 years in the White House, what I learned was this, that virtually none of the problems that crossed my desk were technical by nature. They were human. They were about love, anger, jealousy, greed, hatred, fear, tribalism, all of those things. And so what I ask people to do all the time when they're encountering a challenge is not to reflexively immediately go for a technical solution or design, but to make sure they understand the human condition underneath that. And the final thing, I think, comes from another conversation I have with a dear friend. I haven't got time to tell you about it now, but he told me, one of the things he asked me once was, when you walk through an urban landscape, when was the last time you looked at the spaces between the buildings rather than at the buildings? And I thought that was such a beautiful analogy, because I think that's my final piece of advice. We obsess with the buildings, the obstacles in our way. And the truth is, no one's going to knock them down, but there are always spaces between them. And the art form is to find the space and have the courage to travel through it, because if you walk through the first space, you'll always find more. And rather than stopping your journey because there's a building in front of you, always look for the spaces. So those would be the three things.
Amazing. How amazing. And on that note, Richard, and your three amazing lessons, which is, think of embracing failure because you learn very little by calibrating something that is right. The second one is address, as Obama mentioned to you, address human issues and not necessarily solve them through technology. And the third one, which is very, very interesting, was look for the spaces between the buildings, because that is where opportunities probably lie. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey, about all the stuff that you so very modestly seem to just ascribe everything to just life happens and everything is by chance. But I'm sure there's so much more effort and so many things that you've done to get there. Thank you for talking to me about your journey as an educator. And finally, thank you for talking to me about your books. Thank you again and good luck.
It's been such an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.